Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Philip Hirsch. I'm Emeritus Professor of Human Geography at the University of Sydney. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of our co-organizers at Michigan State University, the University of Hawaii's Center for Southeast Asia, the East-West Center, and Chiang Mai University Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar, which is on socio-environmental dimensions of oil palm and rubber plantations. This is part of a four-part series on Southeast Asia in transition, which is running from September to December this year. We'd like to note special thanks to the Luce Foundation for its support of the collaboration, and also invite anyone in the audience to reach out to us if you'd like to know more about us. Just one very quick housekeeping note, and that is that we're going to be running this as a panel discussion for about 1 hour, the first hour, with a number of questions and interactions between the speakers. And then we'll have half an hour at the end for audience questions, comments to the panelists. But please feel free to send in your questions along the way, and please use the Q&A function to pose your questions. Don't feel that you need to leave your posing of the questions right till the end, although we'll deal with them after the first hour of interaction. Well, today's panel on plantations in Southeast Asia will focus just on two of the many plantation commodities, on rubber and palm oil, and on three of the countries in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, and Indonesia. Of course, plantations have a long history and are often associated with colonial antecedents of today's large-scale agriculture. But today we're going to mainly be looking at contemporary issues. Our panelists have a wide and really interesting range of research and experience on these commodities in the countries. And we have four panelists today. They include Vong Nantavong, who's a research fellow at the Center for Development and Environment at the country office in Laos, associated with University of Bern. Lisa Kelly, who is assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Colorado, Denver. That's the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences. Andina Desita Ekaputri, who we also know as Sita, is a PhD candidate in Natural Resources and Environmental Management Program, University of Hawaii at Manoa. And Jean-Christophe Dupart is Research Associate at the Jean Blou Agrobiotech University of Liège, Belgium, but he's actually based in Cambodia. Okay, let's get going without further ado. And what I'd like to do is to start by posing a kind of overview set of questions on the extent of plantations and the pattern of large and small holdings across the region. And I invite each panelist in turn to start off today's discussion by helping paint an overview of the state of rubber and oil palm plantations in Cambodia, in Laos and Indonesia. But also feel free to tell us a bit about your own work on this topic. And as part of that overview, perhaps you could also note that plantations actually cover a range of different configurations in respect of landholding size, ownership, access, and so on. For example, concessions, nucleus, plasma, and other outgrower models, smallholder-based models. So in fact, the topic covers a range of different configurations. What does the rubber and oil palm agrarian structure look like in the three countries we're talking about? How's it evolving? And under what economic, political, or biophysical forces? So perhaps Sita, you could start us off.
Thank you very much, Phil, for the introduction. And thank you also for the organizers of this event for the opportunity for me to talk in this important topic. And also thank you for all the audience that has come to this webinar. So my name is Sita Eka Putri, or Sita. I'm from Indonesia. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Natural Resources and Environmental Management in the University of Hawaii at Manoa. My dissertation topic focuses on palm oil and sustainability certification. Just a brief story that I started to look at palm oil more closely when I joined Dr. Kimberly Carson's, my supervisor's lab, as her PhD student back in 2017, where I worked on a project that evaluates the environment and socio-economic outcomes of an oil palm sustainability certification that is called the RSPO, or Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I will explain this further in the discussion later, but basically that RSPO aims to help the producers of the palm oil to achieve a more sustainable practices by requiring conformances with rigorous social environmental criteria. I'm currently in the stage of, actually I've just finished the data collection at this, just this week. It took me 2 years to complete the fieldwork. My study sites are in Indonesia, specifically in Kalimantan, which is one of the major regions of oil palm production. So I'm pretty glad with that. And then I'm looking forward to do the data analysis really soon. Okay, so I'll just jump in really quickly to answer the first question on the state of oil palm plantations. If I could pull out the slide, please. Thank you so much, Jamie. So this is what the oil palm fruit looks like. The palm oil, the oil that is produced from this oil palm fruit, there are two types that can be produced: the crude palm oil that comes from squeezing that fleshy fruit, and the palm kernel oil, which comes from crushing the kernel. So when we talked about the state of the oil palm plantations, we have to know that why palm oil is a successful crop. So one of the reasons is partly due to the fact that its caloric productivity is much higher than other major edible oils, such as soybean, sunflower, rapeseed, and it actually has the least production cost. It also has, according to our paper, it has a long shelf life and odorless and highly versatile. And you can also actually find palm oil in almost every packaged food and hygiene products in supermarkets. So can I go to the next slide, please? So this is a chart that shows the area harvested globally of the oil palm plantations. The blue line on the top is the total area harvested at the global level, and then the other lines are the top 5 producers of palm oil, which is Indonesia, Nigeria, Malaysia, Guinea, and Thailand. These data, I extracted it from the FAO set. And as we can see here, obviously the harvested area of oil palm has increased significantly, even more than double in the last 2 decades. And it makes them the fastest growing major tropical crops. And as we can see here on the orange line, this represents Indonesia, and it has a similar trend with the total area harvested, and which shows that Indonesia play a really prominent role in the palm oil production. It accounts at the moment more than 50% of the oil palm production. Next slide, please. This is also a chart that shows the FFB production globally and for the top 5 producers of oil palm. Similarly, the production has increased rapidly. It has almost tripled since 2000 and accounts for more than 1/3 of the global production of vegetable oil. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is how the plantation area in Indonesia looks like over time. It increases over time, and if we look at the different type of producers in Indonesia, there are mainly 3 types of oil palm producers. They are the state-owned companies, the private-owned companies, and the smallholders. Okay, I had got a reminder that my time is up, so I couldn't reach to the second question. Sorry, but can I just go to the next slide, please? Really quickly, just to show the distribution of, this is the oil palm concessions, not the plantations. So initially it was in Sumatra. The plantations started commercial in Sumatra, and then over time it expanded to other islands of Indonesia and Kalimantan as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Cedar. In fact, you have started to address the second question, reminding us that when we talk about plantations, smallholders are very much part of the picture. So perhaps I could hand over to Lisa to follow on.
Sure, and actually, can I go back? I do think actually Ceda's slide might be helpful here. But I'll start while that's being pulled up. I want to say thanks to all the organizers. Thanks to Philip Hirsch for moderating. Thanks to the fellow panelists. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's really exciting to be here, really nice chance to sort of come back to Hawaii where I started some of my work. And I'm approaching these questions today and with broadly geographical perspective, disciplinary training in political ecology, land change science, and on the basis of different kind of opportunities to live and work in Southeast Asia since roughly 2008. And so some of the themes I think we'll touch on: state territorialization, forest change, land grabbing are relatively older to me, but my focus on oil palm plantations and expansion in Indonesia is relatively newer and born of a collaborative project with Drs. Nancy Peluso, Soraya Afif, and Kim Carlson since about 2017. And we're trying to think about how plantations relate to concurrent increases in labor migration and how they inform, sort of in ways connected to labor migration, sort of broader processes of land and forest change in these regions. And if you'll actually advance that slide, I think, yeah, I wanted to touch on this briefly. Maybe one more too to this benefit sharing scheme that I remember Sita has up there. There's obviously been sort of huge transformations in how oil palm is governed, and in particular, a growing embrace of foreign direct investment since roughly the 1980s. And this has been associated, coupled to trends of decentralization, associated with Suharto's fall and the fall of this autocratic New Order regime in the late 1990s, with more of an embrace of what has been, if you'll just advance one more slide. These feel like important points to touch on. Oh, you took out the benefit sharing scheme, I realized. Well, so essentially what I wanted to note was, no worries, that the actual terms under which people have engaged and communities have been engaged in these schemes have changed dramatically as a result, and particularly following the introduction of a Kemitraan model. And what this actually reflected was more of an abandonment of some state subsidization for smallholder development, and really what's been a favoring of corporate claims over land as opposed to smallholder development as part of these schemes. So there have been concurrent increases in smallholder production, but alongside this broader shift in benefit sharing schemes that John McCarthy also writes about so nicely. And I wanted to, I think in context of what that like sort of hockey stick graph that Sita shows on the expansion of oil palm as sort of a durable force in the Indonesian landscape, I wanted to touch on just a couple ways in which this rapid sort of expansionary dynamic hasn't only stabilized plantations as part of Indonesia's agrarian structures, but has also led to all kinds of tensions and conflicts that I think are part of these trends and which actually may be destabilizing plantations also as a force. And so I'll touch on just a few. I'm sure we'll have time to talk about this and think about this across the region, but these range from the failures of plantations to deliver the work they often promise, inability to remunerate people with sufficient wages that offset lost income from claimed lands, questions of land dispossession and conflict, losses of community control over common property resources. And these are some of the dynamics that are simultaneously intensifying land conflicts, inequalities, and scarcities. I think some of the Ministry of Forestry and Environment's data from Indonesia suggests that some 59% of the country's oil palm companies are linked to land conflicts in some way. And of course, and I think this has captured the sort of global imagination and the popular imagination for people thinking about oil palm development outside Indonesia, have been all the environmental unsustainabilities, ranging from peatland, sort of drainage and clearance to, and land subsidence and fires, to agroforest clearance and forest loss. And so I highlight these sort of as an important concurrent trend, I think, linked to plantation expansion, because I think they're also a force shaping its evolution, and contestations or counter visions of agrarian development. And I'll highlight just a few that maybe we'll have time to think about or come back to. One of these are growing demands for the recognition of customary land claims. We see this in the formation of the Alliance for Indigenous Peoples, established in the late 1990s, and sort of that has increasingly pushed for these recognitions, securing a 2013 Indonesian constitutional victory that customary forests should not be classified state forest areas and subsequently parceled out to industrial investors. And all kinds of other conflicts and resistances at local scales, direct land occupations, blockades, everyday sort of resistances. These have been really important in Southeast Sulawesi, where I'm working. And one last trend to just sort of touch on as a counter movement here are the various efforts to clean up the environmental sustainabilities, and Roundtable for Sustainable Oil Palm Deforestation Moratoria and whatnot. So I'll pause there, but nice to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And of course, we're going to get back later on to talking about some of the certification schemes and so on. Now let's turn to mainland Southeast Asia, and perhaps hear also a bit more about rubber as a commodity. So Jean-Christophe.
Sure. Thanks, Phil. And thanks to the East-West Center for inviting me to have the opportunity to talk about rubber in Cambodia and share ideas with the panelists. Very, very happy to be here. So my name is Jean-Christophe Liepar. I'm from Belgium. I'm based in Cambodia for nearly 20 years. And I have an affiliation with the University of Liège in Belgium, Chamblou Agrobiotech. My research revolves around agrarian change and smallholder farmers in the region mainly. And my interest for rubber actually is quite recent and has emerged in the context of a forest trend project that was coordinated by Kevin Woods, who needs no introduction. And the project, in this project, we basically aim to look at the trajectories of change of smallholder rubber and the entire sector as a whole over the last 20 years, a period which is characterized by two main rubber price boom, which is now extended into a quite long bust period. Yeah, so that's basically my interest. Can I have the slide, please? Thank you very much, Dana. All right. So in Cambodia, I will mainly refer to Cambodia here. In Cambodia, there are two main models of rubber production, the large estate model and the smallholder rubber model. The large estate basically consists of plantation that used to be run as state-owned enterprises, state-owned plantation, and have been privatized in 2007, 2008. And you have, of course, the economic land concession model that has been granted by the government of Cambodia to international companies, but also domestic companies since the early 2000s to promote agro-industrial development. And then you have the smallholder rubber sector, which consists of approximately 30,000 families who have most of them small area of rubber. 53% of them have actually less than two hectares of rubber land holding. So this map shows basically the spatial distribution and the size of the different model. The total area granted for rubber is basically about 1 million, 0.96 million hectares. The former state-owned enterprise are located here in basically the cradle of rubber, where rubber started long ago during the colonial time in province of Kampong Cham and Tomong Khmum. All the ELCs are located in the eastern part of the country, on the right side of the big lake, and covers, as you can see, a huge area. 76% of the total area granted for rubber production is basically inside ELCs. And the smallholder rubber are basically scattered across the country, but with two main hotspots. one which is around the former state-owned enterprise here, and in the northeast in the province of Ratanakiri. I should say maybe that the official figures we have for smallholder rubber probably underestimate the extent of this mode of production, because the government does not have resources to basically go and update the data, because there is also an underreporting by smallholders, and because there is a mismatch basically between the statistics on production and the export. So it doesn't look good on the national statistics to report a higher quantity that is actually legally exported. All right, so can we now move to the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. So now if you look at the actual dynamic of plantation of rubber, we see that in this graph here on the upper part, you see that you have a very important peak in 2011, 2012, both for the ELCs and the smallholder rubber. A peak which is due to a couple of factors. One is, of course, the price of rubber, which was very high at this time. Second is that the granting of ELC by the government was also at this peak at this moment. And a third element, which is, I think, very important, is a land titling campaign that the government initiated at this time to basically provide security of smallholder tenures in the upland, which has basically incentivized them to extend the plantation of rubber. But as you can see also, after 2012, the dynamic also decreased. And again, for several reasons, because there were no much land available suitable for rubber, for smallholders and for companies, but also because the government initiated a moratorium on new economic land concession due to the massive conflict that basically happened around the country. Another aspect, which, and I will finish with this point, is that the companies who were granted rubber on economic land concession were not always very interested to plant rubber. Most of them, a lot of them, were interested in the timber, to basically take the timber out of the land. And this has resulted in basically very poor performance of economic land concession for rubber production. And basically, there is an underutilization of land granted as economic land concession. So overall, we can say that the smallholder farmers, if you look at the total area planted, the area of rubber by smallholders is very important and represents a very, I would say, a very strategic part of the sector appended to the concession system. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Well, I think we're already seeing that when we talk about plantations in Southeast Asia, we're looking at big differences between countries, but also quite commodity-specific issues as well. And I'd like to invite Wong to tell us a bit about rubber and plantations in Laos.
Thank you, Phil. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for this opportunities. My name is Wong Nantawong. I work for the Center for Development and Environment, or CD's University of Bern. I'm based in Laos and come from Laos. And I'm currently engaging a research project on inventory of the lands concession in Laos. So I have been engaging in this research project since over the last 6 or 7 years, and this work is embedded in the overall research project that collaborates between the government of Laos and government of Switzerland with the technical support from the Center for Development and Environment. So the overall research projects that collaborate with two governments try to support the making the best use of the existing information for better informed decision making for the sustainable development in Laos. My research focus is not on rubber specific, but covers a wide range of communities in agriculture subsector, but also in other sectors, including mining and hydropower. So if I can have the slides, I try to address 2 questions. Rubber is the most predominant commodities invested under land-based investments in agriculture by foreign and domestic investors in Laos in terms of the number of deals and size. So up to the 2017, more than 220,000 hectares were granted for the land concession schemes. And so the rubber plantations under the land-based investment account for allow for 37% of the total area granted for land-based investment for agriculture purpose. The significant expansions of rubber plantations under land-based investments by foreign and domestic investors started in 2002, 2003, as you can see in the upper right graph there. But the boom of this crop was in very short period between 2002 and 2006. The area granted to rubber plantations dropped significantly since 2007, and only a very small amount of land was granted to rubbers in 2009. In Laos, the investment in rubber plantations mainly come from 2 of its neighboring countries, including Vietnam and China. And these investors mainly target the lands along the border areas to their countries, as you can see in the map there. Vietnam mainly is target in the southern part of Laos, and China in the north. And also there are some domestic investments, but mainly target the lands around the capitals of the countries in the Vientiane capitals. Rubber plantations in Laos are basically small scales. So as you can see in the maps that most of the plantations are small, with the area granted are smaller than 500 hectares. As you can see the size of the dot there. And in terms of the implementation status, my research found that not all rubber plantations that approved by the governments were successful implemented on the ground. So as you can see in the pie charts, there's up to 2017, only is about 37% that has reached to the operational phase, and allow for 1/4 still under development phase. And interestingly, that nearly about 1/5 that's never started of the operations. And the rubber plantations in Laos are planted in the 3 different schemes. The land concession models by foreign and domestic investors, as I already explained, and the second models by the smallholder plantations. And there is no official update figures the extent of the plantation under smallholder, but it's estimated that allow 80,000 hectare planted under this scheme. And the third models by contract farming between the smallholder and also the with the investors, but there is no official statistic about the extent of the plantation under contract farming scheme. So the 3 different model scheme, but there are difference across the regions for the smallholder plantations planted across the regions, but contract farming mainly take place in the northern province, and the large scale models in the southern province. I think I stop here. So back to Phil.
Thanks, Ron. Well, I think you and everyone's given us a really full picture of the patterns and the complexity of plantation of palm oil and rubber across the region. We've been talking largely about plantations as a land issue, but I wondered to what extent each of your studies and the more general research on plantations in Southeast Asia also reveal labor issues associated with plantations. And if we're talking about labor, also to think about migration, movement of people, both international and domestic migration to plantations, from plantations, and how does this inform the political ecology of oil palm or rubber plantation establishment and development in the three countries? Associated with this is also, of course, the contemporary question of the extent to which COVID-related restrictions on movement affect plantation labor. Sita, would you like to start us off on this issue?
Sure, Phil. So when we talked about labor issues in Indonesia, I think I'll just give a context of what the state of oil palm labor looks like in Indonesia. Basically, there are three different classes of labor in oil palm industry in Indonesia. The first one is the permanent workers or the staff. These workers usually have a clear working contract and they receive like pay stubs more regularly. And then the next class is called the plantation laborers. Now these workers, sometimes they don't have any working contracts or they may not receive any pay slips. Usually they are these people who work as a harvester or like a maintain worker in the plantation. And then lastly, there are casual and unpaid laborers. These casual laborers are hired directly by the company and are usually referred to as a daily wage worker. So in Indonesia, an NGO called Sawit Watch estimated that 70% of the oil palm laborers are daily wage workers, including the plantation laborers. There are a lot of NGOs that reported about labor issues. The issues that are mainly touched upon is about labor violations, such as forced labor, child labor, gender discrimination, the poor health and safety equipment, and exposure to toxic pesticides and provision of low wages. For example, when we talked about labor abuse or forced labor, this in Indonesia, in the plantation in Indonesia is, is a serious issue because Indonesia labor law has regulated the limit of working hours to be 7 to 8 hours a day. But however, plantation laborers are reported to work longer hours, around 12 hours per day, which is way beyond the maximum number of working hours regulated by Indonesian law. And so this presence of forced labor can actually bring a serious implications because, for example, in December 2020, there's a report from the US Customs and Border Protections that they detained palm oil products that contain palm oil produced by a palm oil company in Malaysia because the production process involved forced labor. And then another issue is like gender discrimination, where Tanya Lee talked a lot about this in her paper. There is like inequality on the wage between women and men, and where women daily casual workers were paid the least. Another labor issue is on health, where the example is the use of chemical in fertilizers and pesticides. There are evidence of a toxic chemical being used in the pesticides, even though companies know that the chemical is highly toxic. And then the last one is in terms of the working condition, where studies found that some companies fail in providing personal protective equipment, such as hard hats and boots for the harvester, or they don't provide any replacement when this equipment is worn out. So despite of this substantial concerns around labor in the oil palm industry, we've found like there's a gap here because the plantation labor conditions have received little academic attention. Tanya Lee also in her studies shows that this neglect of plantation labor is a significant gap in the literature, and if oil palm plantation keeps expanding, which is I think it's going to keep going like that, it means that millions of people will engage as plantation workers. And related to my study, which looks at the impact of our RSPO certification on labor issues, currently there is very, very limited field-based research and study that looked at laborers. Okay, and then, so I guess one last thing that I would like to say is that I think most research have focused more on land issues, such as like the land tenure, the forest degradation, like the degradation of the land compared to labor issues. Lisa,
Well, thank you very much, Sita. And of course, the two may be connected in all sorts of ways. For example, there's a question of whether plantation labor includes substantial numbers of those who've lost their land to the very concessions that are now employing them. But I don't know whether any of you are addressing that, but that's an open question. But there's the question of migration as well. And I believe that, Lisa, you've been working on questions of migration, remittances, and so on.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Sita, for that really nice overview of some of the labor issues. It's really resonant with some of the stuff I see in the Southeast Sulawesi field site where I've been working, wage withholding, actually accidents that have led to the death of workers, various kinds of health challenges. And just to build on, I guess, what Phil introduced, I guess I'd just note that I sort of agree with this take that while there aren't too many focused labor studies, at least that I've seen, I think these labor questions are embedded within bodies of work on rural work and livelihoods and land issues to the extent that they tell us something about why people might accept these terrible conditions and how they're forced into them, or how plantations are able to recruit and reproduce labor forces despite them. And I'm thinking of some of the work on rural livelihoods that's pointing to eroding returns to smallholder farming, various kinds of agroecological and climate challenges on smallholder production. And I think when some of these dynamics converge with dispossession losses and land control, they can certainly beget dependence on plantation work despite widely recognized labor injustices. And so I guess, maybe this is an interesting point to connect it to the migration question, because potentially, migration into plantations, of course, is part of how companies recruit workers, play workers off one another. But migration out of plantation regions potentially is a way in which workers and people can exercise some agencies and might actually counteract some of these terms. And as I noted, I guess in introduction, this is a theme I've been thinking with as part of this collaborative project with Nancy Peluso, Soraya Afif, Kim Carlson. And our interest sort of really begins with this second expansionary dynamic, right? Which is as plantations have expanded, what we know is that there's also a rapid expansion in the numbers of people leaving agricultural and rural areas for extra local work, either domestically or internationally. People are traveling further, they're contracting longer. And often, interestingly, with respect to plantation politics and ecologies, they're able to supplement and at times replace agrarian income streams with remittance capital. And so I think, there's some really important and interesting studies that have begun to trace the connections between outmigration and plantation change. Thinking of Rebecca Elmhurst's work, Ari Dharmastuti, Keith Barney's work. But they've also been a focus of our work, what we're trying to build and understand in these 4 distinct plantation zones in Indonesia. And we're asking questions around, well, how did the land enclosures and changes shaped by plantation actually beget shifting rates and patterns of outmigration? And 2, how do these new mobilities or intensified mobilities in some instances speak back when migrants return home or send money home back into these agrarian areas? And I'll sort of sum up here with just a couple early insights from this work because we're new and drawing some of these conclusions. But one thought is that yes, when migrations absorb land and it's taken and they don't offer sufficiently remunerated labor opportunities, then yes, people do leave. And in times they try to earn money that either supports less productive rural lifestyles or allows them to invest in some of the opportunities associated with concessions. And that's one thing going on in Southeast Sulawesi now around smallholder oil palm plantings. And a second early finding relates to how these outmigrations may in fact expand land access to some extent for those smallholders remaining in these areas, despite pretty significant tenurial constraints. And that's something Ramesh Sunam and John McCarthy have written about really powerfully, albeit not in plantation context. So I'll stop there. There's obviously all kinds of questions related to COVID you just raised, but I think I've talked too long, so I will stop there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. And I wonder whether Wong and Jean-Christophe, whether we're seeing similar questions being posed and studies being carried out and patterns being identified in Laos and in Cambodia and in the case of rubber. Wong, perhaps we could
Yes,
go over to you.
thank you, Finn. Yeah, actually, my research also look at this question. So maybe I put up my screen slide. So yes, thank you. Yeah, so my research also look at the labor issues in rubber, but also compared to other type of communities also. So the assessment that we look at in around 35 land deals in rubber plantations and also another agriculture communities in 2017. The results that the research that I found that actually the rubbers generates a significant number of jobs in rural areas compared to others communities, type of communities. And so more than 70% of jobs created by land-based investment in agriculture sector that come from rubber plantations. And so in total, number of jobs that created by 35 deals that more than 27,000 jobs. But the jobs in rubber plantation mainly in the mainly the seasonal jobs and mainly in the development phase, as you can see in this figure here, the right graph here. So the job mainly is created in the development phase, including land clearings, plantings, and weeding. But the jobs in the operational phase, especially the harvesting, that significant amount of job offered to foreign migrants. And also in terms of job in Laos, that the governments clearly state that job with development of activities, including the land-based investment, should give the priority to the local people, especially those who were displaced by the investments. But as you can see in these figures on this graph, that in many cases, investors hire the foreign workers more than the government limit. So the government limit for hiring the foreign workers up to 15% of the physical labor, and then 25% for the technical expert. But you can see in some type of job here, for example, management, technical expert, that's require the higher labor skills. For investors, brings a significant number of foreign workers. And also for rubber plantation, the harvesting, that's supposed to be the long-term job, but investors prefer to bring the foreign workers. And so even the rubber generate a higher number of jobs in the rural areas, but these jobs do not come as the livelihood choice, but later they are the necessities, meaning that people who engage in the employment in the plantations, they lost significant of land and resource, so they have to rely on the employment with the plantation to compensate for the loss. But for those who still access to the resource and land, they are unlikely to accept the job in the plantations because in terms the wages generally are low, and very often that lower than the national official minimum wage, for example, compared to the minimum wage in 2015. It's supposed that one worker should paid around $5.6 per labor per day, but very often lower than this minimum wage, the wage paid by the plantations, in the plantations. So the rubber generates the higher number of jobs, but they also cause the greater extent of the land and resource displacements. So compared to others type of the communities, actually the impact on the rural livelihoods in terms of the employment perspectives, rubber is quite create a more adverse impact on the rural livelihood. Maybe I stop here. Thank you.
Okay, a very quick follow-up question. Well, where are these foreign workers coming from? Are they coming from the countries that the plantations are owned by? For example, do we see Chinese labor in the north and Vietnamese labor in the south, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, so my research did not explore in depth and in terms of the origin of the worker, but my observation that mainly come from the country origins of the investors. So, and especially in the south, so mainly come from Vietnam. But in the north is less likely that investor will bring the worker from outside. So mainly it happens in the central and in the southern part with the large scale investments.
Thanks very much, Rong. And Jean-Christophe, are we seeing similar patterns in Cambodia?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think there are two ways to bring this labor into the labor questions into the discussion. One with a sort of macro structural, economic structural transformation perspective, and one at the macro level. I think in Cambodia, it's very important to recognize that these rubber landscape, particularly where the concessions have been granted, are areas of very intensive in-migration process. Migration from people moving from lowland area, going to the upland. And they are moving because basically an increasing number of them are living on a very, very short land, agricultural land holding, in, basically for rice production. So they don't have much option. One option is to find a job in industries and service sector in the cities, for them as household lead or the children. But the fact is that these non-farming sector basically the jobs they create do not catch up with the increase of the active population. You know? So the agrarian transition is a very uneven and very truncated process. So that's very, so that the second option that people have, they basically move to the upland because they need land, they need labor, you know. And this migration movement has been paralleled with the granting of economic land concessions. So on the upland, you have this massive overlap of land claims between, on the one hand, the concession and the smallholder farmers. And of course, this is not a level playing field, you know, so the people are basically evicted. Migrants and locals are basically evicted from their land. And the land which they need very much. So they are directly evicted of their farming land, but also they are evicted because of the privatization of the common pool resources. So I think that's a very important dimension. I think more at the local level, we see that the narrative is, is that the plantation create jobs, and jobs will create, the diversification of the local economy, etc., etc. But there are many buts. There are jobs created in Cambodia, that's for sure. No need to deny it. I mean, you need one tappers for rubber, for 3 hectares to manage 3 hectares of land. So there is a potential for 100,000 people, wage laborer, working on the sector, on the plantation alone. But the key problem is basically the opportunity cost of the land that has been granted to concession. And this opportunity cost is very high. So the value that would have been generated by the smallholders if that land wouldn't have been granted as concession is very high. So what we see, the people, instead of working for the concession, they basically move around and migrate to elsewhere. So we see associated with this pattern of concession, we see multiple migration of people moving around. So I think that's another very important aspect of labor and migration related. The second aspect then is that because of the price of rubber has declined so much over the last years, the capacity of the concession to hire people, has also declined. And a lot of these concessions are basically now running with very limited staff, and some even have stopped completely tapping, So that's another aspect. And there is another one, and I will finish with this, which is sometimes overlooked, I think, in the literature, is that particularly for ethnic minorities that have been that have faced a lot of issues with this concession, is that it's quite humiliating for them to basically work for companies that have been responsible for evicting them from their resources. And I recall the word of a person in Modokiri province a few years ago who told me that no way we are going to work with these concessions. And he told me, not without humor, he told me that these guys, they have basically steal our house and kitchen, and now they ask us to become their own cook, you know. So, and I think it reflects some important perspective from the local level. So the paradox of all this is that people are migrating to escape concession, and the concessionaires, they're basically looking for jobs because they don't have enough labor to run the plantation.
Thanks, Jean-Christophe. And you also then thereby sort of reinforced Lisa's earlier point about the migration as a kind of agency for workers or potential workers or those who've been dispossessed. Let's move on now, since we do want to keep time at the end for Q&A, and expand outwards a little bit, looking at international markets and commodity chains associated with these two commodities of palm oil and rubber. And I've got really three questions which I'll invite you to address. One is to ask how the different types of plantations have adapted to the very significant changes in prices, particularly in rubber with the boom and then the decline in prices. How has this affected the sector as a result? The second part of the question is whether, as plantation crops, these two commodities follow similar patterns, or whether there are patterns specific to rubber and to palm oil, respectively, in terms of the nature of the commodity chain. And then associated with this, to look at the issue of certification systems, which have been introduced as a way to tackle both social and environmental problems in various tropical commodity crops. What are the barriers, but also what are the opportunities in oil, palm and rubber supply chains, respectively? What do these opportunities present for the effectiveness or otherwise of sustainable use of land and fair use of labor to grow these crops in Southeast Asia? So, Jean-Christophe, would you like to start us off here?
Sure. Can I have the slide? I know we are running a bit behind time, so I will try to be quick. Yeah. So basically, to address this question of commercialization and value chain, so I have put here in a very simplified format the structure of the value chain for rubber in Cambodia. So the smallholder rubber here at the bottom part of the slide are basically selling the latex to two kinds of processing units, either processing units that transform the latex into so-called TSR, technically specified rubber, or to RSS, rib smoke sheet. Yeah. So there are a number of these processing units in the country. They are processing approximately 27%, based on recent data, 27% of the total latex produced in the country only. So, yeah, and they are both of them running at 50% of the capacity. So the bulk of the production is basically is coagulated on farm by the smallholders and directly exported informally, so illegally, to Vietnam. It's illegal because there is the legislation in Cambodia forbids to export unprocessed rubber products. But the way the exporters manage to do this is that they maintain the price of the coagulum, so the so-called cup lump, the unprocessed rubber. They maintain the price always a bit higher of the price of the latex, so that they can export it. And the idea, of course, of exporting it informally, illegally, is to not pay the export tax, which is $750 per ton. So, and this is a very interesting political economic case, of course, because there is just a couple of a few very important exporters who basically collude with each other from the Vietnamese side and the Cambodian side, and who basically dictate and control the entire market of the of rubber for the country. So now with a drop of price in rubber, it's clear that the margin for the smallholders, they become very sensitive to very small difference of price between what they could sell as latex or what they could sell as coagulum. So basically, the drop of price in the international market has reinforced the illegal export of rubber to Vietnam. You know? So this is one aspect. And the consequence of this is that basically all the processing units in Cambodia are basically not dying, but they are running dry. You know, and there's a huge loss of value added for the industries in Cambodia because of that. The other aspects of this issue of price and the drop of price is we see at the smallholder level, we see basically a concentration of landholding. So very classic capitalist polarization process between, on one hand, smallholders who basically can accumulate land and capital, and though others, a group of other smallholders who basically are selling the labor to these large smallholder farmers. So there are these two dimensions I wanted to flesh out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Christophe. Sita, are we seeing similar patterns in the case of oil palm and Indonesia?
Yeah, I think there are some similarities, but if we could show the slide of the oil palm value chain, that would be very grateful. Okay, so as we can see here, this is a simplified version of the oil palm value chain in Indonesia. I think this is not the latest version, but that's okay. So as we can see here, the palm oil value chain consists of a wide variety of stakeholders. The left side of the graph shows the downstream actors, and the right side is the upstream actors. So if palm oil fruit is harvested on from a plantation every 10 to 12 days, they sourced it from estates that owned by the plantations or from smallholders. There are different types of smallholders, as we've mentioned before. And then they will transport this harvested fruit. They will be loaded onto a truck and transported to a mill, and within 24 hours of picking. So the transportation is limited to an area around 50 to 100 kilometers because of the nature of the oil palm, that the quality can rapidly deteriorate after harvesting. And then in the mill, palm oil oil palm fruit is crushed to extract the crude palm oil. And then after that, the crude oil will be shipped to overseas to a refinery. And then the crude palm oil will then be in the refinery, will be refined and separated. And this refined palm oil will then be transferred to manufacturing facilities, where the palm oil will be mixed into other products such as the soap, like cosmetics, or food packaged. So what makes this chain unique is that because the nature of the oil palm is vulnerable, it must be processed in a very short time to maintain quality. And so for producers such as smallholders that don't really have a bargaining positions because they have to sell the products quickly, this may lead to an abuse of power by collectors and oil palm mills. They, for example, they can give inaccurate information to smallholders in order to maximize their profits. And what's unique on the oil palm value chain is it has a low vertical integration, meaning that the large number of there is a large number of oil palm fruit suppliers, but only a handful of corporates that control the refinery and the export. So there are rarely an entity that owns the upstream and downstream actors at the same time. And so this brings a challenge when we want to improve the environmental outcomes from the oil palm plantations, because it's hard to trace, like each of the oil palm fruits to each producer. And so that is also like one of the part of the challenges when we talked about sustainability certification, because of this wide variety of the producers, and specifically also smallholder, where smallholder in Indonesia accounts for more than 40% of the oil palm area. From a paper that I'm a co-author with Michael Egan, here some of the founding says that the independent smallholders who in 2019 managed around 1/3 of the oil palm land in Indonesia are still underrepresented in the sustainability certification and RSPO, and also in the high carbon stock assessment governance. And even though RSPO acknowledges that this smallholder inclusion is still very limited in certification and has offered a group certification, so a smallholder group certification, as an option for independent smallholders to join the certification scheme. By 2021, less than 1% of the RSPO certified oil palm area in Indonesia was managed by independent smallholders. Another barriers that are also interesting to look at when it comes to the effectiveness of a sustainability certification, looking at the oil palm value chain, is because the oil palm producers are diverse, including companies. There are companies that may not be interested to participate in sustainability certification at all, especially if you look at the market of the oil palm, where China, India, or Southeast Asia, they are not environmentally sensitive as European Union or the United States. So these companies could have ample opportunity to market products that are not covered by certification. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Sita. And I think before we move on, Vong, you have something to add on the commodity change in Laos.
Yes, if I can have 1 minute, so if you can put up the slide, just really summaries about relate to the question, the how the investment response to the rubber price, the decrease of the rubber price. So as you can see in this graph here, you see that, since 2007, 2008, the new investments, because of the decrease of the rubber price, and the new investments shift to another commodities, including livestock and also flex crop, and so on. So you can see that in terms of the commodities, agriculture commodity productions investment, that's actually follow this the market force respond to the price, and then because of the the food energy crisis 2008 to 2007 2008, and then that's kind of the extract maybe the new investments in to the food and energy crops. So just to summarize here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vong. Well, before we move to questions, we've got some wonderful questions coming in now. Let's finish off with I guess a couple of topical issues, and that is the question of how the current climate change agenda, and also, of course, the COVID-19 situation is affecting patterns of land and labor, reshaping the politics and the ecology of such plantations. And in the interest of time, I think let's just invite, I'd like to invite Lisa to address these two questions briefly before we open up for questions.
Okay, thanks. And I want to get to these wonderful questions coming in too, so I'll be really brief here. Is there any chance to pull up that slide I had sent in? Yeah, so I don't have time to totally go into this, right? But I did want to just start with an appreciation of the really dramatic changes that are anticipated for Southeast Asia, for many of the countries we're talking about, and are already manifesting, including intensifications in flooding periodicity, intensifications in drought, the meteorological conditions that shape drought, and extreme heat days. And this work by Camilo Mora of actually UH in the geography department. And so these projections are really bleak, and my entry point into them, and maybe what I'll reflect on before we go into these questions, have been the three extreme flood events that have played out in and around the oil palm plantation that I've been thinking about in Sulawesi, as many as have occurred in the past 5 to 6 decades. And these certainly reflect a changing climate, long-term decadal increases in precipitation, anomalous rainfall events during and in the run-up to floods. And at the same time, maybe I'll point to a couple other dynamics that we can think with, which is how climate change is intersecting and working through some of the changes we've already discussed, and leading to challenges, I think, not only for people living in and around these areas, but also companies themselves in reproducing their operations. And just a couple things I'll pull out from the Sulawesi case in relation to these extreme floods are how they've led to layoffs and challenges in securing work and workforces, how there have been layoffs because people can't access plantations in the case of floods or heavy rains, how this can result in people being rehired months later under much more casualized terms. Floods, of course, are destroying croplands. They're contributing to losses and further challenges on smallholder sites of production. And I think, you know, they're calling into the fore like the very violent environmental changes that plantations have shaped that are co-producing these floods, whether it's land clearance and accelerated surface runoff, or whether it's these siltation and landslide events that can block the river and lead to localized flooding, even where it didn't used to occur. And so I think, you know, on the one hand, one response to this has been out-migration, right? People leave these areas, but they can't find work. And maybe this is where I'll reflect on connections to COVID, because what COVID has done in this context, as people increasingly depend on out-migration for a number of reasons, is it has dried up some of those sources of extra local work, workers returning home from Malaysia, extra local sort of commuter migration work sources being dried up. And so I sort of agree with this point that's come up, right? Migration as agency, I guess I was partially making it myself, and migration as an escape when you don't want to accept these terms of work. And what we're seeing, some early findings on the conjunction of sort of COVID and climate in Sulawesi, is that they're forcing people back into these forms of employment, even though they're widely recognized to be, you know, unsustainable and unjust. So people are coming back into plantation work in the context of these crises and some of COVID-linked mobility challenges. So I hope that wasn't too rushed. I hope that said something of meaning, but I look forward to the questions we have. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa, and the panelists for a really rich discussion. And we've also got a fabulous set of questions coming in from the audience. I'd like to start off with a question from Robert Cole, which is addressed to all of the panelists, which is how rubber and oil palm intersect with national policies on agricultural commercialization. Who would like to start?
I can go first. Okay.
Please.
Yeah, I think in case of Laos, that's very much, you know, kind of the pushing or kind of the by the national policies, and then in Laos, not only in rubber, but in other communities also, you know, that popular policy framework on the turning the land in capital, and also the commercialized agriculture that governments have the, you know, promoting agriculture commercializations for, you know, increase the international trade, and also anticipate that these large scale investments in rubber and other crop could, you know, drive the kind of the boost the agriculture productions, and also in terms of the rural developments that expect to, you know, create the job opportunities in rural areas. And then, yeah, very much you know, in the favor of the blame that the smallholder agriculture production is kind of the root of the poverties, and then through the large scale plantations, and then would bring the development opportunities. And then of course, you know, the waste labor could have kind of the stable income that contribute to improve the quality of life of the rural population. Thank you.
Thanks, Wong. How about in Cambodia?
Yeah, I mean, in Cambodia, the narrative is very much the same. It's not called turning land into capital, but it basically means the same thing. The Cambodian government used rubber really as a key commodity, strategic commodity for export, to generate revenue from exports. But I think it has also a sort of political aspects, because it helps also build relationship with China and Vietnam, predominantly Vietnam and China, who are the main importers of unprocessed or processed rubber. I think this question of commercialization needs to be also understood in the context of, bilateral relationships between Cambodia and its neighbors, but also overall as part of the ASEAN construction. But to me, it also raises a number of questions in terms of, basic food security, because these areas of land are basically dedicated to commodities which are not edible for people. And with the rising cost of food price that we are witnessing these days, I think the question of concession brings new sets of questions in terms of food security. How the country basically manage its food security for its own population in this context of massive trend towards export of non-food commodities.
Thanks, Jean-Christophe. And are we seeing something similar in Indonesia, either Sita or Lisa?
Lisa, you want to start? I could start a little bit. I guess in the oil palm industry in Indonesia, and the government, of course, has seen it as a very important commodity crop. The government also plans to keep, increasing the production of palm oil, and through this program that's called the community oil palm planning, or Peremajaan Sawit Rakyat, so replanting of the oil palm. But then at the same time, the government of Indonesia also received pressures from the international society that because of the impact of oil palm on the environment, where it causes like deforestation, for example. And so the government also has issued extended the oil palm moratorium as well in Indonesia.
Okay, thank you, Sita. I think we'll move on to keep the questions and topics flowing. We have a couple of really interesting questions about the relationship between oil palm and rubber expansion and forests. The first one is from Nancy Peluso, and it's directed particularly to Jean-Christophe and your point about the issue of timber exploitation prior to making the rubber plantations. This was also an important part of the process in parts of West Kalimantan. I suppose another way to think about this is whether these plantation concessions are essentially forest concessions in disguise. This is my own take. And related to that is a question from Richard Vilsteke about the biodiversity impacts of palm oil and rubber expansion in reducing biodiversity, which seems to be an issue of long-term importance. Jean-Christophe, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, very happy to respond to this question. So in the 80s, 90s, forest concession has been introduced by the government to manage the forest, but also as a sort of tool for post-war state formation. And to this regard, I think the forest concession were very, very effective because they helped generate a lot of revenue for the government. After the war, it was very important. But in terms of forestry, it has resulted in a quite disaster outcomes. The forest was quite, completely unmanaged. And so the government issued different bans. So in '96, it issued a ban which is still valid now, a ban on export of timber. And in 2002, it introduced another ban on any logging operation, 2002. So for a lot of companies who were granted economic land concession, the sub-decree and the process of agro-industrial development was a very efficient way for them to circumvent basically this logging ban. And so they were, this why the reason why I said that they were interested primarily on the timber, that was there. And then when the timber was basically off of the land, that's another job, to run a rubber plantation. So that's the reason why also a lot of these areas that were granted as concession remain idle. not utilized, and also a reason why the people living around, seeing these land basically being not utilized and not productive, have decided to just move on and move in this land, which has created a huge problem of land tenure security. So I think it's all related.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. There's a question also on the impacts of land confiscation on ethnic minorities, particularly in northeastern Cambodia, but we may also see in Kalimantan and in many upland areas of Laos. Would anyone like to take on this one? The question of how indigenous groups and ethnic minorities are affected by or end up as labor within these plantations?
I can maybe continue on this. I don't know if it's okay with.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, in the northeast of Cambodia, the key impact of concession has been basically the disappearance of fallow forest that was part of the shifting cultivation system. So as long as you don't have any fallow forest or very short duration fallow forest, it's not possible for people, for ethnic minorities, to continue doing shifting cultivation anymore. So an increasing number of them have also started to engage in permanent agriculture, including rubber. So, and this is a movement we have seen. So there's sort of a progressive transformation of rotational Sweden agriculture into more permanent agriculture. And the ethnic minorities now, they're basically living between both worlds, on one hand, between the old traditional way of, doing their own shifting cultivation, and at the same time engaging into market commercialization and export with, and they are not in a dichotomy. So they are creating a sort of new livelihood, new approach for land use and land tenure management that borrows from these two completely different worlds.
Sita, do we also find in Kalimantan that ethnicity is an issue in a relationship between plantations and former landholders, or in terms of plantation labor?
Thank you, Phil. I think this is more of an area for Lisa. I think my focus is more on sustainability certification and palm oil.
Sure, Lisa, do you have some insights?
I feel slightly uncomfortable wagering some thoughts here, but will you repeat the broader question? I was sort of so distracted by Jean-Christophe's answer. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the question is, to what extent? Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah. I think in Laos, maybe similar to what Jean-Christophe described in Cambodia. I think the target areas of the investments are mainly in the uplands areas, and very much that's the ethnic minorities, and then their livelihoods very much depends or rely on the natural resource shifting cultivation. So and of course, the investment that's impacts on directly on livelihood, because that's decreased food productions and also collecting food from forests, and then that's so basically the ethnic minority who live in the upland areas and also rely on the forest. Not in the case of Laos, many cases that they don't lost their lands, the farmland, but they lost access to resource. So that is kind of the impact on their livelihood resilience. So that's the big issue in Laos here. So and then my research also suggests that in terms of the long-term impacts, because you can see that the job opportunity that could be the alternative for them to compensate for the loss. So their livelihood become the precarious, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Wong. Let's move on then. And this is a question from Miriam Stark. It's a two-part question to both Jean-Christophe and to you, Wong. which is for Jean-Christophe in particular. Your map didn't specify ownership, but perhaps you could tell us whether many of the state concessions are leased to Chinese investors, as they are in northern Laos. And the question for Wong is whether there are different social issues associated with plantations that receive investment from outside Laos compared to those where the investment comes from within the country. So perhaps Jean-Christophe and then Wong.
Yes, I don't have the exact figures, but yes, there are some concessions that have been granted to Chinese concessionaires, Chinese companies, but I would say the majority of the rubber concession have been granted to Vietnamese companies, which are part of the Vietnam Rubber Group. Some of them are not, but so I think that's the main part. China is, by the way, also very active in other concessions in sugarcane, other commodities in Cambodia. But they are also facing, I mean, increasing number of, and this holds true also for Vietnam, but they are dealing with an increasing number of conflicts, which basically the state cannot manage and which is up to the company to basically manage. And so the Chinese investors are also withdrawing progressively from the concession model and try to engage with smallholder, with some form of contract farming, outgrower schemes, which allows them to continue to source a commodity which is very important and very strategic for their own development, but at the same time not mess up with the land issues in Cambodia. So this is a trend that we see, the concession model evolving towards a more nucleus estates / outgrower scheme, and China is one of the forefront of that.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that interesting one. So in case of Laos, so the investments even call themselves or registers officially the foreign investors or investment, but in the reality, is many cases that they always linked to the domestic or the local, especially the elite. Always someone's behind that to make the deals conclude or happen. So that makes the things more complicated, in terms of the governance of the land-based investments. And in some investment, they perform very poorly, but when the governments always ask for, okay, the poor performance should be quick out of the countries. And when the sectors or the governments, the ministry propose to do so, and then very often, oh, we cannot touch this investment. So that the investment, and in terms of the impacts, the difference between the domestic and foreign investment, I think there's a few aspects that are different in terms of the scale of investments. Very often that foreign investments are larger scale, and then of course cause greater extent of the lands and resource dispositions compared to the domestic one. And in terms of the investment approval, decision making for the foreign investments as more take place in terms of the top-down approach compared to the domestic one, so without consultations or consents, and that's the difference between the domestic and foreign investment. And in terms of the social aspect, employment, for example, of course, foreign investment prefer to bring their own workers, and then that's a difference from domestic one. So that also the impact, but domestic investments also very often that are small scale and often rely on the family labors instead of the employed local worker.
Thank you very much, Wong. Well, unfortunately, we're running short of time. We've got time for just one more question. In fact, I'm going to combine a couple of policy-related questions to finish off and ask if you could give brief responses, if you could, please. The first question is from Courtney Work, who asks, in addition to national policy, what about donor agendas and international development goals with respect to the plantation sector? And Micah Fisher has asked, more specifically in the case of Indonesia, for Lisa or Sita, how do you think the current policy developments around the omnibus law are likely to influence the processes you've described? Let's start with the second question. either Lisa or Sita, I would like to take this one up, and then we'll come on maybe asking Wong or Jean-Christophe to address the international development question.
And Sita, I'm happy to defer, but I feel like you've done our heavy lifting. So I can take this one if you'd like. Yeah, okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, the omnibus question is such a good one. And it's, I think, how does it influence the processes we've described? In some senses, it, I think, re-entrenches them, right? So given the changes to the forestry law and the environmental law that have been sort of scooped up into them. And I guess for those of you who don't know, this was the omnibus bill is a job creation bill as it's been framed in Indonesia that was passed in October of last year. Really sweeping changes to the permitting processes, the processes of environmental impact assessment. And in particular, one thing I think is really important are changes in these forestry laws, which used to require some 30% of a particular area within a river basin be maintained in forest. This has been stripped. In addition, changes to the designation of forest areas and functions have basically no longer require the approval of Parliament. So this sort of suggests that the government is anticipating further reclassifications of forest area, permitting further development in what were, more protected forest areas. And so all of this, I think, is of the sort of nature of deregulation and these policies for loosening investment and foreign direct investment that are pretty ominous. And maybe I'll just connect briefly to this question around donor agendas. I think, donor agendas have been largely subsumed around many of these market-based schemes like RSPO and climate pledges, REDD+, et cetera. And in a way, they counter this. And in another way, they propose sort of concurrent market-based solutions that don't really engage with this context of deregulation and the failure to enforce existing sort of non-voluntaristic regulations on the books. So hopefully that addresses some of what we're talking about, but thanks for those questions.
Thank you, Lisa. And Jean-Christophe, would you like to just give us a very quick comment on the donor and international development agendas?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few words. I mean, donors traditionally in Cambodia have been very reluctant to engage in economic land concession because it was a very touchy topic, of course, for political reasons that you can imagine. The main donor interest, I would say now, is now toward this so-called global partnership for sustainable natural rubber, which is a sort of alliance between many tire companies based in China and in Europe, a group of states, government facilitating the process, but also with a lot of participation from NGOs, international NGO, and also representation from federation of smallholder groups. And this is not a real certification process, but they are trying to basically make sure that the latex, which is sourced to industries, tire industries, manufacturers, are basically coming with environmentally sound policies and socially just policies as well. The big problem is, of course, the traceability, of the latex. How this group of actors make sure that the latex, the rubber that goes and go through the value chain from the smallholders respects all the conditions of a environmentally sound and socially just rubber. And I think the international attention now is really towards this market-based approach, as Lisa just mentioned.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, and to all our panelists. I think we could easily carry on this conversation if we had time for another few hours. We've got some wonderful questions we haven't been able to get to. Apologies to those who sent those in if we haven't addressed your questions or got to them, but we do need to wrap up very shortly. So first of all, please let me thank all four panelists for a wonderful set of responses to these questions. It's not often we get to talk about different commodities in different countries and therefore see some of the complexities, the land labor interactions and so on. So I think it's been, for me anyway, it's been a very rich discussion. Before we close, I'd just like to remind you also that this is not the last in a series, but the series, we also have a webinar on Wednesday, the 8th of December, on the politics of conservation and heritage at the same time. That's 2 to 3:30 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. So I invite and encourage you all to attend and spread the word. But in the meantime, please let me thank not only the panelists, but also those who sent in questions, those that were answered and those that were not, and to all the attendees for your participation in this really interesting and rich seminar. So thanks from me, and I think with that we'll call it a close. Thank you.